Her dog vanished into the same patch of land every day, but no one could follow where he went. Silver Creek was already bracing for winter. Axes rang through the air, woodpiles grew taller by the day, and smoke curled steady from every chimney. Everyone was preparing. Everyone except Agnes Halbrook. At 72, she walked her quiet land with her German shepherd, Coda, while her yard sat bare, or so it seemed. No one saw where the dog disappeared each day. No one asked why she never bought firewood. What would you think if someone in your town prepared in a way no one understood? By the time the first hard frost settled over Silver Creek, most folks were already ahead of it. You could hear it in the mornings, the steady crack of axes biting into wood, the hollow thud of logs splitting clean down the middle, truck beds rattling past, stacked high with firewood, tarps flapping in the cold wind. Smoke drifted low across the valley, thin blue lines rising from chimneys that had already been tested, already trusted. Winter wasn't something people here waited for. They prepared for it like it was a known enemy. At the edge of town, near the bend where the road turned to gravel and the houses thinned out, there was a small place most people didn't pay much attention to until this time of year. That was where Agnes Halbrook lived, 72 years old, widowed for longer than most could remember, and living alone, if you didn't count the dog. Her house sat a little off from the road, set back behind a line of old apple trees that hadn't been properly trimmed in years. Their branches twisted in every direction, some heavy with rot, others still stubbornly alive. In the summer, they gave a little shade. In the fall, they dropped more leaves than fruit. Now, in early winter, they stood bare, gray, still, watching slowly among them that morning, her boots pressing into the thin crust of frost that had formed overnight. The ground gave a soft crunch with each step. Not loud. Just enough to be heard if you were close. Coda stayed beside her. A large German shepherd with a thick coat already grown in for the cold. Black across his back, tan along his legs and chest. His ears stayed upright, always listening, even when nothing seemed to be there. He didn't wander, didn't bark without reason. When Agnes stopped, he stopped. When she bent to touch the soil near the base of one of the trees, he lowered his head slightly, watching her hands. The land behind her house didn't look like much. Wild grass had grown uneven across most of it. Parts of an old fence leaned inward, half collapsed from years of neglect. There were patches where the ground looked disturbed, darker than the rest, but nothing neat. Nothing organized in a way that made sense from the outside. To most people passing by, it looked like land that had been given up on. Agnes didn't seem to mind. She carried a small metal pail in one hand. Inside, a few tools, nothing heavy, a short-handled shovel, a pair of worn gloves, a coil of something that looked like thin tubing tucked beneath the rest. She set the pail down near the base of a slope behind the orchard, paused there for a moment, then glanced at Coda. He had already turned his head toward the thicker brush at the far end of the property, watching, always watching that direction. Agnes didn't say anything. She simply picked up the pail again and moved a few steps closer, brushing aside some of the taller weeds with her boot. Then she stopped, not for long, just long enough. Then she turned back toward the house. From the road, a pickup slowed as it passed. 2 men inside, one driving, one leaning forward with his elbow resting on the dashboard. See that? The passenger muttered, nodding toward the yard. The driver glanced over, squinted a little. Looks worse every year. The passenger let out a short breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh. She ain't stacked a single log yet. The truck rolled on, tires crunching over gravel. They weren't the only ones who had noticed. In Silver Creek, people paid attention to things like that. Who had their wood ready? Who didn't? Who had patched their roofs? Who was still waiting? It wasn't gossip exactly. It was habit. By midday, the hardware lot near the center of town was busy. Men loaded bundles of split pine into trailers. A young couple argued quietly over the price of a space heater near the front display. Someone tested a chainsaw, the engine whining sharply before settling into a steady growl. Near the entrance, a stack of firewood sat under a hand-painted sign. Seasoned, dry, ready. Most of it would be gone by the end of the week. Across the street, an older woman paused with a bag of groceries in her hand, watching as another truck pulled in. "You hear about Agnes?" she said to the man beside her. He shifted the sack of feed he was carrying from one arm to the other. "What about her?" "Still hasn't bought wood." The man glanced toward the far road, even though you couldn't see her place from there. "Maybe she's got some stored up." The woman shook her head slowly. "I pass by every morning. There's nothing." A small silence settled between them. Not concern, not exactly. Just something unfinished. Back at the edge of town, Agnes had returned to her porch. She set the pail down beside the door and wiped her hands against the front of her coat. The fabric was old, worn soft at the edges. It had seen more winters than most people in town could remember. Coda climbed the steps ahead of her, turned once and waited. She opened the door. Warm air didn't rush out. Just stillness. Inside, the house was quiet. Simple. A table near the window. A chair pulled slightly away from it. A kettle resting on the stove, not yet lit. Agnes stepped in and closed the door behind her. Outside, the wind shifted. Not strong. Not yet. But colder than it had been the day before. And across Silver Creek, people kept stacking wood. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up just enough to carry the smell of pine and sawdust through town. It drifted along the main road, slipping through open doors and settling into the corners of places where people gathered. The feed store was one of those places. It sat low and wide, its wooden siding faded from years of sun and snow. The bell above the door rang sharp whenever someone stepped in, cutting through the hum of quiet conversation inside. That day, the stove near the back had already been lit. A small group of men sat close to it, boots stretched out, hands wrapped around paper cups of coffee that had long gone lukewarm. They spoke in short bursts, weather, livestock, road conditions, nothing out of the ordinary. Until the door opened again. The bell rang. A draft of cold air followed. Agnes Halbrook stepped inside. She didn't look around much, just paused long enough to let the door close behind her, then walked toward the counter with the same steady pace she always had. Coda followed at her side, his nails tapping softly against the wooden floor. The conversations near the stove didn't stop, but they shifted. Subtle. The kind of shift that happens when people don't want to look like they're paying attention, but are. Dale Mercer leaned back in his chair, one arm hooked over the backrest. He was broad across the shoulders, his jacket still dusted with bits of wood from the morning's work. His voice carried easy, like he was used to being heard. "Well," he said, not loud enough to be called out, but not quiet either. "Look who's braver than the rest of us." A few of the men chuckled under their breath. Leonard Pike, sitting beside him, tilted his head slightly, eyes following Agnes as she reached the counter. "Reckon she's got a secret stash we don't know about?" he added. Dale snorted. "Must be invisible wood. Burns real clean, I hear." More laughter. Not harsh. Not cruel in the way people imagine cruelty. But it lingered. Agnes didn't turn. Didn't pause. At the counter, Ruth Ellison looked up from a small box of invoices she had been sorting. She was in her early 60s, her gray hair pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck. Her eyes softened the moment she saw who it was. "Afternoon, Agnes," she said. Agnes gave a small nod. "Afternoon." Her voice was quiet. Not weak, just measured. She set a few items on the counter. A bundle of seed packets. A roll of thick plastic sheeting. A small coil of copper tubing, no longer than her forearm. Ruth's eyes lingered on the tubing for a second, then on the plastic. She didn't say anything about it, just reached for a paper bag and began placing the items inside. Behind them, Dale shifted in his seat again. "You planning to grow tomatoes in January, Agnes?" he called out, a grin stretching across his face. Agnes paused just long enough for it to be noticeable, then continued watching Ruth pack the bag. "Something like that," she said. Simple. No edge to it. That seemed to amuse them more. Leonard let out a short laugh. "Well, if that works, you let us know. Might save us all a lot of chopping." Another round of chuckles. Ruth folded the top of the bag and slid it gently across the counter. "That'll be 12 even," she said. Agnes reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small bundle of folded bills. She counted them carefully, not slow, not rushed, just exact. Set them down. Ruth picked them up and tucked them into the register. Their eyes met for a moment. Ruth hesitated. "You doing all right out there?" she asked, her voice lower now. Agnes nodded once. "I am." It wasn't defensive. It wasn't meant to reassure. Just a statement. Coda shifted slightly beside her, his head turning toward the group near the stove. His ears remained upright. His gaze steady. Not aggressive, just aware. Dale noticed. "Even the dog looks like he knows something we don't," he said, half laughing. Agnes reached down briefly, her hand brushing the back of Coda's neck. The dog didn't move, but his posture softened just a fraction. She picked up the bag, turned toward the door. The bell rang again as she stepped outside, the cold air closing in behind her. Inside, the laughter faded quicker this time. Not gone. Just shorter. Leonard leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "She really hasn't bought any wood, has she?" Dale shook his head. "Not that I've seen." One of the older men near the stove, who hadn't spoken yet, cleared his throat. "Some folks do things their own way," he muttered. Dale shrugged. "Yeah, till winter shows up." Ruth stood behind the counter, her hands resting lightly on its worn edge. She watched the door a moment longer than necessary, then turned back to her work. Outside, Agnes walked down the road with Coda beside her. The wind had picked up again, brushing against her coat, tugging lightly at the edges. The sky had taken on a duller shade, the kind that came before longer stretches of cold. Coda stayed close, his shoulder nearly touching her leg as they moved. At the bend in the road, Agnes paused, not because of the wind, not because of the cold, just for a moment. She glanced back towards a town, then turned forward again. and kept walking. Behind her, the feed store door opened once more, and somewhere in Silver Creek, another log split clean in two. Agnes didn't look back. She followed the same road she always did, the gravel soft beneath her boots, the wind pushing low across the valley like it was searching for something. Coda stayed close at first, his pace steady, matching hers step for step. But as they neared the edge of her property, something in him shifted. It was small, easy to miss if you didn't know him. His head lifted just a little higher, his ears turned, not toward the road, but toward the far side of the land, where the brush grew thicker and the ground sloped slightly upward. Agnes noticed. She always noticed. But she didn't say anything, just walked up the steps, set the paper bag beside the door, and went inside. Coda lingered on the porch for a moment longer. Then, without a sound, he turned and slipped off the side, disappearing behind the line of old apple trees. From the road, the property didn't invite much curiosity. It looked the same as it had for years, untended, uneven, quiet in a way that made people pass by without slowing down. There were no neat rows, no fresh-cut paths, no signs that anything of value was being worked back there. But that didn't stop everyone. Late that afternoon, Luke Garner cut across the side road on his way home from the mechanic shop. He was 17, tall for his age, but still carrying the loose, uncertain movements of someone not quite settled into himself yet. He had heard the jokes. He'd laughed along with them. Not because he believed them all, but because that's what you did. Still, something about it had stuck. The way Agnes hadn't reacted. The way the dog had watched. Luke slowed his steps as he passed her place. His eyes drifted across the yard, taking in the sagging fence, the scattered patches of darker soil, the way the brush thickened toward the back. It didn't look like anything was being grown there, but it also didn't look empty. He stopped at the edge of the ditch, hands in his jacket pockets, waited. Nothing moved. No sound except the wind shifting through dry branches. Then, a flicker, low to the ground. Coda. The dog slipped through a narrow break in the brush, so quick it could have been missed if Luke had blinked. Luke straightened slightly. "That's odd," he muttered to himself. Most dogs didn't move like that, not around their own yard, not with that kind of purpose. He glanced back down the road, no one watching, then stepped over the ditch. The ground felt softer than he expected, his boots sinking just a little as he crossed onto the property. He moved carefully, not wanting to draw attention, even though there was no one around to see him. The closer he got to the brush, the quieter it felt. The wind didn't reach as strongly here. The trees blocked most of it. The branches tangled together in a way that made the space feel smaller, more closed in. Luke pushed through. Twigs snapped lightly underfoot. He followed the direction Coda had gone, eyes scanning the ground for movement, for tracks, for anything that might explain where the dog had disappeared to. At first, there was nothing, just thick undergrowth. Then, a few steps in, the ground changed. Subtle, but different. The slope dipped slightly, just enough that you wouldn't notice it from a distance. The soil here looked darker, not freshly turned, but not left alone either. Luke crouched, brushing his fingers across the surface. It was firm, packed, like it had been worked. He stood again, frowning. "Coda," he called out, his voice low, uncertain. No answer, no movement. He took another step forward and lost the path. It happened fast. One moment he was following something. The next, it was gone. The brush thickened again. The slope evened out. The ground returned to its uneven, natural feel. There were no clear tracks, no openings, no sign of where the dog had gone. Luke turned slowly in place, trying to reorient himself. Everything looked the same. Same tangled branches. Same patches of dead grass. Same cold air pressing in around him. He let out a breath. "All right," he muttered. He took a step back, then another. Pushed through the brush again until the openness of the yard came back into view. When he stepped out, the difference hit him immediately. The wind returned. The space widened. It felt normal again. Luke glanced back once more at the place where he'd gone in. From here, there was nothing. No path, no opening, just a wall of brush like it had always been. He stood there for a second longer than he meant to, then shook his head and stepped back toward the road. Inside the house, Agnes moved quietly between the table and the stove. The kettle had begun to warm, a soft hum building beneath the metal. The paper bag from the feed store lay open now, its contents set out in neat order across the surface. The tubing, the plastic, the seeds. She handled each piece with care, not rushing, not lingering, just working. Coda returned without announcement. The door hadn't opened. No sound had marked his arrival. One moment, Agnes was alone. The next, he was there, settling near the wall, his breathing steady, his coat carrying a faint trosse of damp earth. Agnes glanced down at him, then back to her hands. "Good," she said quietly. Nothing more. Outside, the sky had begun to dim, the kind of dim that came early this time of year. Luke Garner reached the main road just as the first real bite of evening cold settled in. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and kept walking. He didn't mention what he'd seen. Didn't think there was much to tell. Still, as he passed the edge of Agnes Halbrook's property, he didn't laugh. Not this time. And behind the trees, where the land dipped just slightly out of sight, something remained hidden, waiting. The next morning came quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that settles in before something shifts. Frost had hardened overnight, turning the ground stiff beneath Agnes's boots as she stepped out onto the porch. The sky hung low, pale and flat, with no color in it yet. Even the trees seemed to hold still, their bare branches unmoving in the early cold. Coda was already awake. He stood at the edge of the porch, facing the orchard, his body still but alert. His ears tilted forward, listening to something beyond the ordinary sounds of morning. Agnes followed his gaze. She didn't rush, just took her time stepping down, her boots finding the familiar path across the uneven yard. The same path she had walked for years, the same ground others thought she had abandoned. Coda moved first. He didn't look back this time, just slipped between the old apple trees and headed toward the thick brush beyond, the same place Luke had stood the day before, uncertain and confused. Agnes followed. Branches brushed softly against her coat as she stepped into the narrow opening. It didn't look like a path unless you knew where to place your feet. The ground dipped just enough to guide her, just enough to hide what came next. The air changed as she moved deeper in. The wind faded. The sounds of the road disappeared. Even the cold felt different. Not gone, just quieter. Ahead, the slope revealed itself, not steep, not obvious, but shaped with intention. The soil here was darker, compacted over time. A low wooden frame sat partially buried along one side, its surface weathered, blending into the earth like it had always belonged there. Agnes reached it, set her hand against the wood, waited a second, then lifted. The panel rose slowly, heavier than it looked, revealing a narrow opening beneath. A breath of warmer air drifted upward, carrying with it the scent of soil and something faintly green. Kota slipped inside first. His paws made soft contact against packed earth below. Agnes followed, lowering herself carefully, then pulling the panel closed behind her. The light changed instantly. Dim above, soft below. A row of small, low-hanging lamps stretched along the space, casting a steady yellow glow that settled gently across the walls. The air inside held warmth, not sharp, not artificial, but steady, the kind that didn't rush at you. It stayed. Agnes stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, then moved forward. The space opened wider as she stepped in. It wasn't large in the way a room is large. It felt shaped, built to fit the land, not fight it. Along one side, raised soil beds ran in a long, careful line. The wood that held them together was rough, cut by hand, but sturdy. Inside, rows of leafy greens grew close together. Lettuce, spinach, small herbs tucked between them. Their leaves held a deep color, untouched by frost. A faint layer of condensation clung to the edges of the lamps above, dripping slowly, feeding the soil below. Kota moved past the beds, his tail low but relaxed now. He circled once near the far end of the space, then settled beside a shallow basin carved into the ground. Water filled it, clear, still, except for the occasional flick of movement beneath the surface. Agnes reached into a small tin resting nearby and scattered a handful of feed into the water. Tiny ripples spread outward as silver shapes shifted below, catching the light for just a second before disappearing again. She watched them briefly, then turned. At the center of the space, a long bench stretched along the curved wall. It didn't look like much at first glance, just packed earth shaped and smoothed over time. But as Agnes stepped closer, the warmth became noticeable. Not strong, not overwhelming, just constant. Hidden beneath the surface, clay pipes ran through the structure, carrying heat from a small chamber built into the far corner. A single piece of wood burned there, low and controlled, its warmth moving slowly through the system. No smoke filled the air, no harsh heat, just quiet, steady warmth that stayed. Agnes set down the items she had brought from the feed store. The tubing, the plastic. She worked without hesitation, measured lengths with her hands, adjusted connections, checked the soil along one of the beds, pressing her fingers into it gently before covering it again. Kota watched her, not out of curiosity, out of habit. This was familiar. Every corner of the space held something he recognized. Every sound had meaning. When Agnes moved toward the back wall, he rose and followed. There, near the farthest edge of the underground space, a small wooden shelf had been carved into the earth itself. Simple, unpolished, holding only a few things: a tin cup, a folded cloth, and something else. Agnes paused in front of it, didn't reach for anything yet, just stood there for a moment, then turned away. Back to her work. Above them, the world remained cold. The wind moved across Silver Creek, pushing against doors and windows, testing what had been built to keep it out. But down here, the air held steady, the soil stayed warm, and the farm beneath the earth continued quietly, as if it had been waiting all along. That night, the temperature dropped again. Not suddenly, just enough that the cold felt heavier when it settled in. Up in the house, Agnes moved slower than usual. Not because she had to, but because there was no need to hurry. The kettle gave a soft rattle as it warmed on the stove. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the walls, steady but not yet demanding. Koda lay near the door, not asleep, just resting. His ears shifted every so often, catching sounds too faint for anyone else to notice. Agnes carried her cup to the small table by the window and sat down. The glass had already begun to fog slightly from the warmth inside. Beyond it, the yard stretched out in shades of gray, the orchard barely visible against the fading light. For a long time she didn't drink, just sat there, looking. Not at anything in particular, just out. Eventually, she set the cup aside, stood, and reached for her coat again. Koda lifted his head. No command was needed. He stood, stretched once, then moved toward the door. They stepped out into the night together. The cold was sharper now. It pressed against the skin, slipped through the seams of fabric if you stood still too long. The sky had cleared, leaving a wide stretch of stars above the valley. Bright, quiet, unforgiving. Agnes didn't look up. She followed the same path she always did, past the trees, through the brush, down into the hidden slope. Koda slipped ahead, disappearing below before she reached the opening. Agnes followed, lowering herself inside and sealing the entrance behind her. The warmth met her again, steady, unchanged. The lamps hummed softly, casting their quiet light across the rows of green. The air smelled of damp soil and something faintly sweet, like growing things that didn't belong to winter. Agnes removed her coat and set it aside, then walked to the back. The shelf was where she had left it, unmoved. She reached out this time, not hesitant, just careful. Her fingers brushed the edge of the photograph before lifting it from its place. It was worn. The corners softened from years of handling. The image itself had faded slightly, the colors no longer sharp, but still clear enough to see. A man stood in the center, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat open despite the cold. There was a kind of ease in the way he stood, like he belonged wherever he was. Elias. Beside him, a younger Agnes, her hair darker then, her face fuller, one hand resting lightly against his arm, and between them, a boy. No older than 8, his smile wide, bright. The kind that didn't question anything yet. Agnes held the photograph steady, her thumb resting just beneath the boy's face. The cave was quiet around her. Even the water in the basin seemed still. Koda moved closer, his body settling beside the bench. He didn't look at the photograph. He didn't need to. He had learned the weight of it long ago. Agnes sat down slowly on the earthen bench. The warmth rose beneath her, not strong, but constant. Her eyes stayed on the image, and for a moment, the years didn't feel so far away. The memory came the way it always did, not all at once, in pieces. The sound of wind first, stronger than tonight, pushing against the house in long, steady waves, then the silence that followed when the power went out. No hum from the heater. No light from the kitchen. Just darkness and cold. Elias had tried to keep things moving, She remembered that. The way he moved through the house, checking windows, closing off rooms, doing what he could to hold the heat in. They had wood. At first, enough for a few days, maybe more, but the storm hadn't passed. It stayed, and the roads closed. No trucks came through. No help reached the valley. Each night the fire burned lower. Each morning the cold crept further inside. She remembered the way the boy had stayed close to the stove, wrapped in blankets, trying not to complain, trying to be strong in the way children do when they sense something isn't right. Agnes closed her eyes, just for a second. But it was enough. The rest came back. The moment the fire wouldn't catch again, the way the air had changed inside the house, the quiet. Too quiet. Elias had left before dawn that morning, said he'd find help, said he'd make it through. She had believed him, because there wasn't anything else to hold on to. But the hours passed, and the cold didn't let up. When help finally came, it came too late. Agnes opened her eyes again, the photograph still in her hands, the cave unchanged around her, warm, steady, alive. Coda shifted slightly, pressing closer to her leg, not seeking attention, just there. Agnes looked down at him for a moment, then back at the photograph. She didn't cry, hadn't in years, not in the way people expect. But something in her shoulders softened, something that had been held tight for a long time. "I remember," she said quietly. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They stayed where they were, part of the space, part of the work. Agnes placed the photograph back on the shelf, not quickly, not slowly, just with care. Her hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Then she stood, turned, and moved back toward the beds. There was still work to do. There was always work to do. Above the earth, the cold settled deeper into Silver Creek. But beneath it, the warmth held, because this place hadn't been built for comfort. It had been built so that something like that winter wouldn't happen again. And Agnes kept working, quietly, without pause. Agnes worked until the lamps dimmed slightly with the hour, her hands moving through the soil, checking, adjusting, covering what needed to be covered. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Above her, the valley had already begun to change. The first snow came before anyone expected it. Not a storm, just a steady fall that started in the early morning and didn't stop. By noon, the rooftops in Silver Creek were dusted white. By evening, the roads had turned slick, the edges of fences softened, and the orchard trees across town wore thin layers of frost along every branch. People noticed, but no one worried yet. It was early, too early for anything serious. At the hardware lot, the usual crowd still gathered, boots scraping snow from the entrance as they stepped inside. "Won't stick," someone said, brushing his coat off. "Ground's not cold enough yet." Another man shook his head, stamping his feet near the door. "Feels colder than last year." "Always does this time," came the reply. The chainsaws still buzzed, firewood still moved, life kept its rhythm. But something about the air, it shifted. It held on to the cold longer than it should have. 2 days later, the snow didn't melt. Instead, it deepened. The sky stayed low, heavy with gray clouds that didn't break. The sun appeared only as a pale shape behind them, offering no warmth, no relief. Wind followed, not strong enough to be called a storm, but constant. It moved across the valley in long, steady breaths, pushing snow into drifts along fences and corners, filling in the gaps people had cleared the day before. Agnes noticed it the moment she stepped outside. The way the air didn't soften with daylight. The way the ground held its stiffness. Koda noticed too. He stayed closer than usual, his movements sharper, more deliberate. His nose lifted into the wind, testing it. His ears shifted often, catching sounds carried from farther away. Agnes said nothing. She walked her usual path, past the orchard, through the brush, down into the hidden space beneath the slope. The farm held steady, warm, unchanged. The soil stayed soft beneath her fingers. The water in the basin remained clear. The heat moved through the earthen bench exactly as it should, quiet and controlled. Nothing here reacted to the weather above. That was the point. Agnes adjusted a valve along one of the pipes, checking the flow. The copper tubing she had brought days earlier now rested along the edge of one bed, connected and secured, guiding warmth deeper into the soil. She worked as she always did, not reacting, not waiting, just continuing. In town, the truck slowed. The main road out of Silver Creek began to ice over in patches. Not enough to close it, but enough that drivers took longer, moved more carefully. Deliveries came late, then later. At the feed store, Ruth Ellison stood behind the counter, flipping through a small notebook as the bell above the door rang. "Another delay?" Dale Mercer asked, stepping in with snow clinging to his boots. Ruth nodded. "Driver turned back halfway. Said the road past the ridge isn't holding." Dale let out a breath, rubbing his hands together. "It's not even December." "Doesn't seem to matter," Ruth said quietly. The stove burned hotter that day. People stood closer to it. No one joked about invisible firewood. Not out loud. But the tone had changed. Just a little. That night, the wind grew stronger. It pressed against the walls of houses across the valley, testing windows, slipping through gaps in doors that had held for years without question. Inside, people adjusted. More blankets. Fires built higher. Wood used faster than planned. Agnes moved through her house without urgency. She lit the stove when needed. Let it burn low. Didn't feed it the way others did. Koda lay near the door again, his body angled toward the outside, listening. Every so often, he stood and paced once across the room, then settled again. Agnes watched him from her chair. "You feel it," she said softly. Not a question. Koda didn't respond. But his ears shifted again, picking up something carried on the wind. By the fourth day, the valley began to feel the difference. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold stayed, sharp, dry, the kind that didn't lift when the sky cleared. The road out of town was now only partially open. Tire tracks cut through the ice, but the edges had built up too thick. Larger trucks couldn't pass safely. One of the delivery vehicles sat stalled near the ridge, its engine dead, its driver waiting for help that hadn't come yet. At the hardware lot, the stacks of firewood were noticeably lower. No one said it directly, but people saw it, counted it, adjusted. At home, Agnes stepped outside once more. The sky was clear now, wide and cold. She stood still for a moment, her breath visible in the air, her eyes scanning the valley below. Smoke still rose from chimneys, but thinner, less steady. Koda stood beside her, his body quiet. his gaze fixed in the same direction. Agnes turned, walked back toward the orchard. Not hurried, not concerned. Just steady. Because everything she needed was already in place, and beneath the earth, the warmth remained untouched, while above it, the cold settled in deeper than anyone had planned. By the end of the week, the sound of axes grew less frequent, not because the work was done, because there was less left to split. In Silver Creek, woodpiles that had once stood tall beside barns and garages had begun to shrink. Not dramatically at first, just enough that people noticed when they walked past them in the morning. A few logs missing here, a stack lowered there. Small changes, but steady. Inside homes, fires burned longer than they were meant to, not for comfort anymore, but for necessity. People stayed closer to their stoves, their movements slower, their conversations shorter. At the feed store, the air had changed. The usual laughter near the stove had quieted, replaced by low voices and longer pauses between words. Boots no longer stretched out casually. They stayed planted, ready to move. Dale Mercer stood near the counter, his gloves tucked into his belt. "How much you got left?" he asked, not looking at anyone in particular. 2 days, maybe 3, Leonard Pike answered from near the stove. "If I cut it back at night." Dale nodded once. "Same." Ruth Ellison stood behind the counter, her hands resting against the wood. She didn't interrupt, just listened. Someone near the door cleared his throat. "Truck's still stuck at the ridge," he said. "County says it might be another few days before they clear it." No one responded right away. The stove popped softly as a log shifted inside it. Then Leonard spoke again, quieter this time. "It's not supposed to be like this yet." No one argued. Out on the far end of town, pipes had already begun to freeze. It started with the older houses first, the ones with thinner walls, the ones patched more times than they had been rebuilt. A slow drip turned to nothing. Faucets stiffened. Metal creaked under the pressure of cold. People wrapped what they could, used what heat they had left. But the cold didn't ease. It stayed. Pressed in. Waited. Agnes watched none of it directly. But she knew. She felt it in the air each time she stepped outside. The way the cold didn't lift during the day. The way the wind carried a sharper edge, like it had settled into the land instead of passing through it. Coda noticed more. His behavior shifted in ways only she would recognize. He moved closer to the edges of the property more often now, pausing longer, listening deeper. At night, he didn't fully settle. His body remained half alert, even in rest. Agnes didn't question it. She simply adjusted her routine, checked the entrance more carefully, cleared the path more often. Inside the hidden farm, everything continued as it should. The soil remained warm beneath her hands. The lamps cast their steady glow. The pipes carried heat quietly through the earth. She worked as she always had, but slower, more deliberate, as if preparing for something that hadn't happened yet. In town, the conversations changed, not all at once, but enough. At the hardware lot, where stacks of firewood had once filled the open space, only a few rows remained. People stood near them longer now, calculating, deciding what they could afford to take, and what they might need to leave for later. Dale Mercer stood there again, hands on his hips, staring at the remaining pile. "You think this'll hold?" someone asked behind him. Dale didn't turn. "Doesn't matter what I think. He reached down, lifted a log, weighed it briefly in his hand. "It's what we've got." Across the lot, a younger man spoke up, hesitant. "My uncle said there's still some supply down near the river road." "River road's iced over," Leonard replied immediately. "You won't get a truck through there." Silence followed, the kind that sits heavy. Then, someone else spoke. Not loud, not certain. "Agnes Halbrook ain't bought any wood." The words hung there for a moment, uncomfortable. Dale turned slightly. "What about her?" "I'm just saying," the man continued, shifting his weight. "She's been through winters longer than most of us, and she ain't doing what the rest of us are doing." Dale frowned. "Or she's just not ready." Maybe. But the idea had been planted. That evening, the feed store filled earlier than usual. Not crowded, but steady. People came in for small things: kerosene, gloves, extra blankets, anything that might stretch what they already had. Ruth moved between the counter and the shelves, her hands busy, her mind elsewhere. Dale stood near the stove again, quieter than before. Leonard sat beside him, staring into the fire. "You ever notice," Leonard said after a while, "that dog of hers?" Dale glanced over. "What about it?" "Doesn't act like most dogs." Dale gave a short shrug. "Some folks train 'em different." "Maybe," Leonard said. "Or maybe it's got a reason." Dale didn't respond, but he didn't laugh either. That night, the cold deepened again. The kind that made wood burn faster. The kind that crept into walls, into floors, into places people didn't think to check until it was too late. In one house near the edge of town, a mother wrapped her child in an extra blanket and sat closer to the fire, watching the last of the logs burn down. In another, a man woke in the middle of the night to the sound of his pipes cracking under pressure. And across Silver Creek, the same thought moved quietly from one person to another, not spoken out loud, not fully formed, but there, lingering. Agnes Halbrook, at the edge of town, not stacking wood, not running out. Back at her house, Agnes stood at the window. The valley stretched out below her, dim under the night sky. Lights flickered in some homes. Others had gone dark early, conserving what they could. Coda stood beside her, his body still, his gaze fixed in the same direction. Agnes rested her hand lightly against the glass. It was cold to the touch. She didn't pull away. "They're feeling it now," she said quietly. Coda's ears shifted. No movement otherwise. Agnes lowered her hand, turned from the window, and reached for her coat. Because what came next wouldn't wait. The wind picked up just after midnight. Not a storm. Not yet. But strong enough to push against doors and rattle the loose edges of things people hadn't thought to fix. Snow lifted from the ground in thin sheets, sliding across the valley like it had a mind of its own. Inside Agnes's house, the air stayed still. She had already lit the stove once, let it burn low, not for warmth alone, but for balance. Coda hadn't settled all evening. He moved from the door to the window, then back again, paused often, listened more than usual. His body carried a tension that didn't show in movement, but in stillness. Agnes watched him from her chair. She didn't ask what he heard. She knew better. The sound came some time after, soft, almost lost under the wind. A knock. Not firm, not certain, just There. Coda was already moving before it came again. He reached the door in 2 strides, his body angled slightly, ears forward, listening. Agnes stood. Didn't rush, but didn't wait either. She crossed the room, her hand resting briefly on the latch before opening it. Cold air pushed in immediately. Sharp. Unforgiving. On the other side stood a woman. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Her coat was pulled tight around her, but it wasn't enough. Snow clung to her shoulders, her hair damp against her face. In her arms, she held a small child wrapped in a blanket that had long since lost its warmth. The woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak. "Ms. Halbrook, Her voice broke. Agnes stepped aside. "You should come in," she said. No questions, no hesitation. The woman moved quickly, stepping inside with the child pressed close against her chest. Coda shifted back to make space, his body lowering slightly as he studied them both. The child, no older than 6, kept her face buried in her mother's coat. Agnes closed the door behind them. The house felt too small, too thin against the cold pressing outside. Agnes didn't look toward the stove, didn't gesture to the chair. Instead, she reached for her coat again. "This way," she said. The woman hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice barely carried. Coda moved first, not toward the front of the house, but around it. Agnes followed. The woman came behind, holding the child tighter now, her steps uneven on the frozen ground. The wind hit them harder outside. Snow lifted again, brushing against their legs, catching in the folds of their coats. The orchard trees creaked softly as the air moved through them, their branches stiff with frost. They reached the edge of the brush. The woman slowed. "You live back here?" she asked, confusion cutting through her exhaustion. Agnes didn't answer. She pushed through the narrow opening, clearing the path just enough for them to follow. Coda slipped ahead. The slope revealed itself slowly as they moved deeper in. The ground shifted beneath their feet, steadier in some places, softer in others. The wind faded as the brush closed around them, replaced by a quiet that felt heavier. The woman stumbled once, caught herself. Agnes reached back without looking and steadied her by the arm. "Careful," she said. They reached the wooden panel. Agnes set her hand against it and lifted. Warm air rose up to meet them. The woman froze. "What?" "Inside," Agnes said gently. Coda was already gone. The woman stepped forward, lowering herself carefully through the opening. The child still held close. Agnes followed behind, sealing the entrance above them. The change was immediate. The cold dropped away. Not completely, but enough. The air inside held warmth that didn't bite, didn't demand, just stayed. The woman stood still for a moment, her eyes adjusting to the soft light. The child lifted her head slowly, blinking, her cheeks pale from the cold. Coda approached them quietly. He didn't jump, didn't bark. He moved close enough that the child could feel the heat from his body, then settled beside her, lowering himself to the ground. The girl hesitated, then reached out. Her fingers pressed gently into his fur. Warm. Real. She let out a small breath. Agnes moved toward the bench. "Sit her here," she said. The woman obeyed, lowering the child onto the earthen surface. The warmth beneath it rose slowly, working its way through the blanket, into the small body wrapped inside. Agnes reached for a cup, filled it from a kettle kept near the heat source below. The water wasn't boiling. Didn't need to be. She added a small amount of honey, stirred, then handed it over. "Slow," she said. The woman nodded, guiding the cup carefully to the child's hands. The girl drank, just a little at first, then more. Color began to return to her face. Not quickly, but enough. The woman sank down beside her, her shoulders lowering for the first time since she had arrived. "I didn't know where else to go," she said after a moment, her voice steadier now but still thin. "We ran out 2 nights ago. I thought we could make it, just needed it to ease up." Agnes listened, didn't interrupt. "Then the pipes froze," the woman continued. "And the fire. We burned what we had left." Her eyes dropped to the ground. "I should have come sooner." Agnes shook her head slightly. "You're here now," she said. That was all. The woman nodded, her eyes closing briefly as she exhaled. Coda shifted closer to the child, his body pressing lightly against her legs, offering what warmth he could without being asked. The girl leaned into him. Not afraid, just tired. Agnes stood near the edge of the space, watching them. The farm hummed quietly around them. The lamps cast their steady glow. The water in the basin moved gently. Everything held. Everything worked. Above them, the wind continued. The cold pressed against the valley, against every house that had tried to keep it out. But here, for the first time, someone else had found their way in, and Agnes made room. Morning came slowly beneath the earth, not with sunlight, but with a soft shift in the air. The lamps still glowed the same. The warmth held steady, but the quiet had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It carried breathing. Small movements. The faint rustle of blankets. Mara Jensen stirred first, lifting her head slightly as if she needed a moment to remember where she was. Her daughter lay beside her, still asleep, her cheek pressed gently into Coda's side. The dog hadn't moved much through the night, just adjusted when she shifted, keeping close. Agnes was already awake. She stood near the beds, checking the leaves, brushing away moisture, adjusting a small vent along the pipe system. Her movements were quiet, careful not to disturb. Mara watched her for a moment, then sat up. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. Agnes didn't turn. "You can rest," she replied. Mara nodded, but she didn't lie back down. Instead, she looked around, really looked this time. The soil beds, the lamps, the water basin, the way everything had its place without looking arranged for show. "You built all this?" she asked. Agnes gave a small nod. "Over time." Mara let out a slow breath. "I never knew." Agnes didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to say. By mid-morning, the wind above had eased slightly, not enough to change the cold, but enough that sound could travel again. Voices, distant at first, then closer. Coda noticed before anyone else. His head lifted, ears forward. His body shifted, alert but calm. Agnes looked toward the entrance, waited. The sound came again. Footsteps. Careful. Uncertain. Then a voice. "Ms. Halbrook?" It was a man. Agnes moved toward the opening, lifted the panel. Cold air slipped in, brushing against the warmth below. At the edge stood Dale Mercer. His hat pulled low, his coat zipped tight, his breath visible in short bursts. Behind him stood Leonard Pike, and another couple Agnes recognized from town. They didn't step forward right away. They hesitated. Dale cleared his throat. "We heard someone came out here last night." Agnes didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. She simply stepped aside. "You can come in," she said. Dale looked at the others, then back at her, and climbed down. One by one, the others followed. The moment they entered, the difference struck them. The warmth. Not like a fire, not sharp or dry, but deep, steady. It wrapped around them before they had time to react. Leonard turned slowly in place, his eyes scanning the space. "Lord," he muttered under his breath. Dale said nothing at first. He just stood there, taking it in. The beds, the water, the quiet system that didn't need explaining. Mara stood near the bench, her daughter now awake, wrapped in a blanket, watching the new arrivals with quiet eyes. "She let us stay," Mara said, her voice simple. Dale nodded once, then looked at Agnes again. "You got room?" he asked. Not demanding, not assuming, just asking. Agnes didn't answer right away. She walked the length of the space, looked at the beds, the bench, the open floor, then turned back. "There's space," she said. That was enough. By afternoon, the valley had shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. Another knock came, then another. A man with his elderly father, a young couple carrying blankets, a woman from the schoolhouse, her hands red from the cold, her face drawn but steady. Each one arrived the same way. Slow, careful, uncertain. Each one paused at the edge of the brush. Each one hesitated before stepping through, and each one fell silent the moment they entered. No one laughed. No one joked. Not anymore. Inside the underground space, voices stayed low. People spoke in short sentences, shared what they had brought. Extra cloth, a small sack of potatoes, a jar of preserved beans. Not much, but enough to offer. Children settled near the warm bench. Adults stood at first, then slowly sat. Coda moved between them, not restless, not anxious, just present. He paused near each new arrival, his eyes steady, his body relaxed but aware. When a child reached out, he allowed it. When someone stepped too quickly, his ears lifted, but he didn't react unless needed. Agnes watched it all from the edges. She didn't organize, didn't direct. She simply made room, adjusted a bed here, moved a crate there, added water to the basin, checked the heat. The system held, because it had been built to. As evening settled again above the valley, the underground farm filled with quiet life, not crowded, but shared. The sound of wind faded beneath the earth. In its place, breathing, low conversation, the soft movement of people who had come not because they understood, but because they had run out of other choices. Dale sat near the wall, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the floor. After a while, he looked up at Agnes. "I guess we got it wrong," he said. Agnes didn't respond. She didn't need to. The warmth spoke for her. The space spoke for her. And for the first time, Silver Creek wasn't scattered across separate houses, burning through what they had. It was here, together, held by something no one had taken the time to see before. And Agnes, she just kept working, quietly, as the valley came back to her. The storm didn't end all at once. It loosened, slowly. The wind softened first, no longer pressing against doors or carving paths through the snow. Then the sky began to open, gray giving way to pale blue, thin at first, then wider with each passing day. Sunlight returned, weak, but steady enough to matter. Above ground, Silver Creek began to move again. Not like before. Not with noise or urgency, but with care. Men stepped out to check their roofs, tapping at ice along the edges. Women opened doors and windows cautiously, letting fresh air into homes that had held too much cold for too long. The road crews finally reached the ridge, clearing the stalled truck, reopening the path that had been cut off. Life resumed, piece by piece, but something didn't return with it. The laughter. It was gone. At the edge of town, Agnes stood outside her house once more. The orchard stretched before her, branches still bare but no longer frozen stiff. Snow had begun to sink back into the ground, leaving behind patches of dark soil that looked almost soft again. Coda stood beside her, watching. Always watching. Agnes stepped down from the porch and moved slowly across the yard. Her boots pressed into the thinning snow, leaving clear prints behind her. The brush at the edge of the property had been disturbed more than usual now. The narrow path, once hidden, had been walked enough times that it no longer needed guessing. People knew where it was. They just didn't speak about it loudly. Dale Mercer arrived first that morning. Not in a truck, on foot. He carried a bundle of wood under one arm, not much, just what he could manage. Behind him came Leonard, holding a small box of tools. They stopped a few steps from Agnes. Didn't cross into the yard right away. Dale shifted the weight in his arms. "Figured you might have use for this," he said. Agnes looked at the wood, then at him. "You should keep it," she said. Dale shook his head. "We're all right now." There was no pride in it, no insistence, just a simple truth. Agnes held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. "Set it there," she said, motioning toward the side of the house. Dale stepped forward, not hesitant this time, just careful. Over the next few days, others came, not all at once, not in groups, individually, quietly. A man repaired part of the fence that had been leaning for years. A woman brought seeds, better ones than Agnes had been using, carefully wrapped and labeled. The schoolteacher came with her sleeves rolled up, helping clear the orchard floor of broken branches, stacking them neatly instead of leaving them scattered. No one announced it. No one made a point of it. They just showed up and worked. The entrance to the underground farm stayed closed more often now, not hidden, just respected. People no longer wandered near it out of curiosity. They didn't need to. They had seen enough. Inside, Agnes returned to her routine, the same one she had followed long before anyone else had stepped foot there. The beds were tended, The water checked. The pipes adjusted. Coda moved through the space as he always had, calm and steady, his presence no longer unfamiliar to others, but still unmistakably his. One afternoon, Mara Jensen returned, this time without urgency. Her daughter walked beside her, her cheeks no longer pale, her steps light against the thawing ground. They stopped at the edge of the yard. "Just wanted to say thank you," Mara said. Agnes nodded. "You're doing all right?" she asked. Mara smiled faintly. "We are." The girl stepped forward then, her hand resting briefly against Coda's side before pulling back. "Hi," she said softly. Coda lowered his head slightly in response. Agnes watched them for a moment, then turned back toward her work. Weeks passed. The snow melted completely. The valley shifted from white to brown, then slowly to green. Life returned to its usual patterns, fields being prepared, fences repaired, routines rebuilt. But the way people moved through it had changed. They noticed more, spoke less about what they didn't understand. At the feed store, conversations still happened near the stove. But when Agnes walked in, no one made jokes, no one called out. They simply nodded, gave her space. Ruth handed her supplies as she always had. "Good to see you," she said. Agnes nodded. Same. Nothing more needed. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the valley, Agnes stood again at the edge of her property. The orchard was still quiet, but not empty. The ground had been cleared in places. The fence stood straighter. The brush had been trimmed just enough to let light through without revealing everything. Coda stood beside her, his posture relaxed, but still aware. Agnes looked out over Silver Creek, at the houses, the smoke rising again, but fuller now, steadier. At the road that had reopened, at the people moving through their lives. She didn't smile. Didn't need to. She simply stood there. Because what had changed didn't need to be spoken. Not by her, not by anyone. It settled into the valley the same way the cold had. Quietly. Naturally, lasting. And if someone passing by looked a little longer now, they might notice something they hadn't before, that the land behind Agnes Halbrook's house had never been abandoned. It had been built. Carefully. Over time. By someone who didn't prepare the way others did, but prepared in a way that mattered when it counted. And that understanding stayed. Not as a lesson told, but as something lived, something remembered. Long after the cold was gone,
Agnes stood there a while longer than she needed to, not looking at the valley, not really. Her eyes rested somewhere in between, where the orchards meet the part people had walked so many times the past week. You should still see it. The brow rests down, the words bend just enough to show where hesitation had once been. Coda seated beside her, not alert this time, just settled. That was new. He wasn't watching the valley anymore. He wasn't guarding the edge like he had been. His weight leaned slightly into her leg, the way he only did when things had finally quieted. Annette let her hand rest against his back. "You knew," she said softly, "not about the storm, not about the cold, about the moment before it all changed, when someone stood out there in the dark, unsure if they should knock. He had heard it first, not the sound, the need." Annette looked down the path again. She used to think the work was enough, that building something strong, something hidden, meant no one would have to feel what she had felt. But that wasn't the part. That changed things. It was opening before anyone asked try, before Brian had time to speak louder than fear. The rising moon ruled the orchards lighter now, warmer, and for the first time in a long while, the place didn't feel like something she had built to hold the past back. It felt like something people had carried forward with her. So tell me, when someone stands just outside your door, cold, uncertain, almost turning away, would you hear it in time to open it?